Okay, let's review for exam 3. This covers chapters 12 through 14. Again, this is a lot of new stuff, so spend lots of time on it. Study using active methods, writing things down, taking notes, making review sheets, or actually quizzing. It's important to plan your time to study in short sections with breaks between them. Okay, the first chapter, chapter 12, important part of that is the functions and divisions of the central nervous system. Of course, the nervous system has functions, sensory, motor, and integration. And the divisions include the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. These are the functional or structural divisions. The functional divisions we'll talk about are somatic and autonomic. Okay, the other big part of the chapter was the function of neurons. Neurons include cells that can receive stimuli and transmit messages, action potentials. They are large, long-lived cells with extensions, dendrites, and axons. Okay, the membrane potentials are changes in charge that occur across the membrane. The resting membrane is charged because there's more sodium outside and more potassium inside. And because there's much more sodium outside, that means the cell is negative. Okay, when a cell is stimulated, sodium channels open, okay, and sodium ions move inside by diffusion, and this causes the charge to become suddenly negative. And this causes voltage-gated ion channels to open nearby, and so the action potential spreads. Okay, cells signal other cells at a synapse, and most synapses are chemical synapses where neurotransmitters are released at the synapse by the presynaptic cell, and they bind to receptors at the postsynaptic cell. And then whatever the receptors do is what happens to the other cell. Okay, in the chapter 13, that's the structure of the nervous system. Part of that is the spinal cord. I tend to produce less emphasis on the spinal cord, but you should be aware that it contains gray matter in a central area, that it contains peripheral areas or columns of white matter that have ascending and descending fibers, that spinal nerves come off the spinal cord, that the cord is largest and thickest in the cervical region. It has a couple swellings associated with the brachial plexus and the lumbosacral plexus, and that it ends before the spinal cord or spinal column ends. Okay, this was also where they talked about stretch reflexes and different types of reflexes. It's one of the simplest actions of the central nervous system. Incoming stimuli are wired so that they lead to motor neurons that cause a very stereotyped response. And so here's a stretch receptor. It's in the tendon. When that's activated, it sends a quick message to the spinal cord. Okay, and the spinal cord will send a quick message to the muscle to contract. This produces a very fast, strong response to specific stimuli. Okay, the other part of this system was brain regions of the central nervous system. Okay, you should be familiar with these regions and their kind of overall structure and what functions are taken there, particularly regions of the cerebrum, the hemispheres of the cerebrum, the lobes of the cerebrum. Okay, those are parts of the cerebral cortex that have specific functions. They should also be aware that parts of the central nervous system work together to produce specific complex response. I talked about the limbic system involved in emotion, but also memory and physiological responses like homeostasis. You should be aware of spinal nerves and cranial nerves. These are peripheral nervous system structures. Spinal nerves come off the spinal cord. Some of these, the afferent portion of these is sensory, the efferent portion is motor, and then there are somatic and autonomic fibers mixed in. The cranial nerves come off the ventral surface of the brain. Nerves are just bundles of axons and dendrites surrounded by connective tissue and endoneurium, and then bonded together by again, more connective tissue into groups of fibers that are going in the same way. Occasionally, there are nerve cell bodies outside the central nervous system. These are called ganglia. There's the spinal nerves and the cranial nerves. There's 12 pair of cranial nerves coming off the surface of the brain. They're given numbers and names. You should know both the number and the name. From anterior to posterior, olfactory, optic, ocular, motor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibular, cochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. There's the picture there. Okay. Then chapter 13, no, 14. This is the somatic nervous system. And so this includes the peripheral receptors and nerves that carry this information to the brain, and then the brain regions that interpret sensory information. That's part of the somatic system. And again, this is senses we can consciously detect. There are general senses, which are located almost entirely in the skin and maybe a little bit in the muscles and tendons, appropriate receptors. There's also some visceral senses that we can sometimes become aware of, but are not truly something that we're aware of. The special senses have large, complex organs. These are like the eyes and the ears, but also the olfactory epithelium in the nose, the taste buds in the mouth, and then the equilibrium structures in the ear. These things all come in by way of cranial nerves. Okay. In the textbook, there was a big focus on the ear. The ear takes information from that's in air, vibrations in the air, and those vibrations are captured by the tympanic membrane and then transferred by the ossicles into vibrations and fluid in the inner ear. And so inside the cochlea, this round structure are fluid-filled canals, and those canals have hair cells. And these hair cells, when there's movement in the fluid, these hair cells detect it, and so send that as information to the brain that we detect as sound. And so there's a nice picture of those there. We also have hair cells in other parts of the inner ear, in the sacral and utricle. These structures again detect movement in fluid that happens when the head may move, and so these can detect changes in the position of the head in the case of the macula, in the utricle and sacula, but they can also detect rotation. Okay, and so that happens in the semicircular canals. Okay, these things go from the structures in the inner ear by way of the vestibular cochlear nerve to the cochlear nucleus in the brainstem, to the inferior cochlea also in the brainstem, and then the thalamus, and then the temporal lobe. Okay, the eye, again, another complex structure here detecting light waves. These pass through the cornea, through the lens, where they are focused onto the retina of the eye where the receptor cells are. The receptor cells are most dense in the central part of the eye, the fovea and macula lutea. The optic nerve has no receptor cells. That's the blind spot where the nerve comes in. The two types of receptor cells are rods and cones. Cones detect color light. There's 3 types. Rods detect the presence or absence of light, so kind of black and white vision. Cones are centrally located in the retina and are for our most precise vision, but they require more light and so are only active during the day. The rods are located in the peripheral regions and are more sensitive. Okay, these are going to be taken by the optic nerve to the optic lobe of the brain. These are the sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. You see there's visual areas in the back of the brain. There's taste areas. There's sound areas. There's the primary somatic sensory cortex that receives information from the skin. Okay. Then I also should say something about motor areas, because this is also part of the central nervous system. Motor nerves are carrying things to the muscles. Somatic motor nerves are carrying things to the skeletal muscles. Okay, and these are all handled in the frontal lobe of the brain. Okay, and there are specific large areas for the eye, for the muscles involving speech. And then there's kind of motor planning areas, the premotor area. Okay. Also in the frontal lobe, in this kind of motor heavy area, are the executive functions. This includes things like working memory, where our thoughts, judgment, concentration, and impulse control is. Motor control is, again, another one of these integrated functions that not only involves the cerebrum, but involves other areas of the brain, the basal ganglia, multiple pathways that often connect to the cerebellum and then are going to descend through the spinal cord. Again, some of these pathways are direct, others are indirect, and so this is kind of a view of this. I just want you to know that there's multiple pathways, not a single one. Alternate pathways, and these are crossing over in there. Okay, a really nice example of the kind of complexity that you get in these somatic brains are involved in speech, okay, where we have both sensory and motor areas that are involved in both the interpretation of speech and in the production of speech. And so I use this this picture to show you that before. Okay, so lots of stuff to look at. Study in short bits. Exam should open on Friday, November 13th. Okay, good luck.